For this video, we'll be talking about the Industrial Revolution and the way that it reshaped the Western world. The Industrial Revolution actually happened in several different stages, and we're going to be talking about kind of what you might call the second stage, which is when the Industrial Revolution really began to take off and reform and reshape the Western world. It began in Europe, specifically, it began in England, and the Industrial Revolution began in the textile industry, which is the creation of new forms of cloth that would allow for cheaper clothing. Textile mills began to spring up throughout England, and it allowed for new materials such as calicos and ginghams that were less expensive to buy, cheaper to make, and that would allow for a more sustainable kind of industry with regards to clothing. When Isaac Singer patented his sewing machine in the mid 1800s, it set the framework for the development of business types of sewing adventures that are going to take place. And this is a picture there of a young child who is actually a worker at the plant there at the factory where there is clothing being made. Transportation was another one of the big changes in the second industrial revolution. We watched the shift begin to happen from horse and buggy to railroads. And railroads began to spread throughout England and also throughout Europe. And for the first time, a nation really began to be connected with itself. You could actually travel from one point in your nation to another one at a much quicker rate than if it was on horseback or horse and buggy. And with the expansion of the railroad industry, you're going to have infrastructure that is going to also expand with regards to bridges and tunnels and depots being established. And this also is going to lead to more types of cities beginning to spring up. And within the cities, we are going to watch places such as restaurants and hotels and theaters and churches as these begin to spring up where the train depot may be located. So all of this expansion of the railroad industry really began to connect nations together, but it also began to watch a transformation into the modern era. The steel industry and the oil industry also boomed during this time as they fed the railroad industry and vice versa. And so, as more and more track is being laid and more trains are being created, we are going to watch a transformation take place in transportation. Communications also are going to change as we move from pigeon pigeon carriers and couriers on horseback to the creation of the telegram, the telegraph, and the radio and the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone, the movement of information throughout nations and between nations is going to be transformational when it comes to the Industrial Revolution. Here's some of our early canals. And then, of course, this is going to give way in a lot of places to the railroad. And you can take a look here on this slide and see how much the time was cut down. This is within England itself, going from one city, from London to Liverpool, or London to Exeter, or London to Birmingham. And you can see the types of time that was saved. News reporting is another one of those things that is going to really change because communication is now beginning to change. News is going to be reported at a greater speed. And this is going to allow not only for information to reach the general public at a quicker speed, but it's also going to give rise to new political forces. And one of the things that's going to happen in this stage is we begin to watch the role of newspapers, the media, and the way that they could inflame public opinion. The newspapers, the media, are going to begin to shape their own types of narratives when it comes to revolutions within nations, when it comes to what side of a war you should be on, or whether or not you should go to war. And the listing that is there, the revolutions, the Franco-Prussian War, the Spanish-American War, all of these were highly influenced by yellow journalism, by newspapers basically taking it upon themselves to share their opinions and push their opinions, sometimes even making up news out into their nation so that they could create events the way that they wanted them to be created. It created also this mass media, obviously nothing near what we have today, but it did create a mass media for that period, and the type of sensational pictures of the world began to emerge as well. One of the other big changes that happened was the rise of coal. This period is known as the Age of Coal, and we're going to watch coal become the main source of fuel for our industrial age. Coal is more powerful than water, which was some of our first forms of power with regards to water and steam. And it is also going to, coal is also going to help create a stronger form of steel. The Bessemer process was created by a man named Henry Bessemer in England, and his idea was to take pig iron, which is a cheaper form of iron ore, and burn out the impurities to create a stronger, more flexible steel. And this steel is going to become the feeder into the railroad industry. And we are going to watch the steel industry take off. And again, coal and the use of coal as a fuel is going to allow for these higher temperatures that also allows for stronger steel to be created. Because it is the age of coal, the coal mining industry is going to boom. And you can see how much coal in each one of these years here was being mined, and then how many miners typically were working. And you can see by the time we get to 1914, which is the very beginning of World War I, we have 1.2 million miners in Britain alone. And we watch hundreds of millions of tons of coal begin to move out into the cities to help for the sustainability of our factories. One of the things that also developed during this period was the young children, the children that began to work. Children worked in the factories, they worked in the coal mines, they worked sometimes out on just the edges of society, they worked in the farms. And the idea behind this was that children were basically miniature adults. And so the coal miners, they would typically choose young children to go deep into the mines. You can see this picture here of a few of our young coal miners, and they became what were called hurriers. They would go deep down into the mines. They would spend just about all day down in there and collecting the coal that was being mined, and they would pull it back up to the surface. Obviously, this is going to lead to huge health issues as part of the aspect of coal mining. Pig iron production, you can see the changes that go on there. That's because of the Bessemer process that is being used as well. There was also, interestingly enough, an agricultural revolution, and this is going to transform not only the agricultural world, but also the really beginning of having food on a more regular basis. Up until the 1800s, Europe basically lived on the constant verge of famine. All it would take would be a few years of bad harvests, and famine could hit, and it did hit. Now with the agricultural revolution, we are going to see crop rotation and being improved, more fertilizer, new types of tools within the agricultural field, more land being cultivated, which led to more food being grown by fewer workers. And this also is going to become part of the key aspects of farmers moving into the cities, getting these jobs in the industrial world, because there weren't as many small farmers needed for food production. The standard of living during the Industrial Revolution, for the most part, went up. It went up within the cities and it went up within the countryside. The biggest changes were in the cities, as the city where the industrialization was taking place, the factories and the selling of goods began to dominate society and culture. And the workforce grew dramatically. It included men, women, and children. Of these three groups, men were paid the most, women next, and children the least amount. The working conditions in the factories, however, were deplorable. They were often very unsafe, Workers would work 10 to 12 hours a day, usually 6 days a week, and they worked at very dangerous jobs. And it was not unusual for people to get maimed or hurt during the industrial age while they were at their jobs. And this is a period of history where there is no workman's comp, there's no unemployment, none of that to cover you. So if you got hurt on the job, you were basically ousted. You couldn't continue your job, and a new person would be brought in. Factory production is going to bring about the increase of the division of labor within factories, as well as watching factories become the basis of the economy. And textile factories, you can see here some of these numbers as we watch the number of employees grow during this period. The factory system also transformed society as we watch people move from more of either an agricultural based society or a small merchant based society to a very rigid schedule, very monotonous work, 12 to 14 hours a day, in dangerous conditions, and the factories began to replace the major means of economic growth. And so one of the things that happened was this divide between the haves, who were called the bourgeois, and the have-nots. The haves were those that were growing wealthy during this time period. They were growing wealthy because of the amounts of money that was being made within the factories. The have-nots, the working class, the proletariat, as they were known, were those that worked in the dangerous jobs without any kind of protection in place. And this divide is actually going to become a base for some of the rise of socialism and communism that's going to dominate parts of the 20th century. The new rich, or the nouveau riche, are those that are part of the management, part of the sales teams, part of the clerks, the accountants, all of those new jobs that were created that were more what you might call white collar jobs. The downstairs, basically, as noted kind of in this cartoon, are the working poor, those that live and work in horrendous conditions. This is Staffordshire. This is a city in England where coal production was so intense, the use of coal within the factories, that the smog just enveloped the city on a continual basis. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the age expectancy in this city alone was like somewhere around 19 or 20 years old because of the amount of smog that was constantly being inhaled. The cities would have dramatic nightlife going on, new parks, watching the rise of the trolleys, the electric lights, all of that, and then also would have the tenements and the slums and the working poor on the other side. And here's a proof of our little coal miners. And so what this is happening is the industrial age is setting the table for a sociological kind of confrontation that's going to happen. And we're going to see the rise of movements to protect the working class, but we're also going to see a rise in movements to challenge the capitalism that is beginning to really develop and take off during this time. And we'll be talking more about that next module.